see. Okay, so thank you, Drew, for the introduction, and of course, thank you for setting up this space for us to chat. Joy and I are well aware that community mental health happens sort of in the community, right, and not just in the building that we occupy on South Street. And so, I'm happy to be here today, so that hopefully this is the beginning of more collaboration. And as Drew said, if there's comments, if there's questions, please type them and I'll try to get to them as I get along. And if not, we'll try to find another time. My email is on the screen, and I would certainly reach out to people to email me if they want to discuss further. So today we're here to talk to everybody about trauma, about secondary trauma, and working in sort of a trauma-informed way with our clients' trauma and those that we experience as providers in our work with these clients. As you can imagine, care and compassion is a big part of this work, but also self-care and self-compassion, right? So if at any point something I say triggers some memories, or it feels like it's somewhat overwhelming, I hope that you'll all take care of yourself during this talk before I get to the topics about self-care. So the first part of the talk, we'll talk a little bit about stress and trauma and how that affects sort of how our bodies, our minds, and our work. I'll with that context, I'll speak a little bit about working in the sort of a person-centered way, but that's both trauma-informed and culturally informed. We'll have a short break at that point for discussion, and then when we come back, I'll talk about secondary trauma. So I think this is a trauma that it's an important point of discussion at any point, but especially so these days, right? Days before the election, second wave of the pandemic looking like it's very much upon us, and so I'm happy to have this opportunity to be here today. The pandemic, to state the obvious, is really a unique sort of disaster. Threatens not only our physical health, but also our financial well-beings, our lifestyles, and takes from us the sort of social connectedness that we really need at times like these. My hope today is to share some of my experiences and thoughts in my work with trauma, and hope that it'll apply to some of your work as well. In this talk, you'll notice I use the words stress and trauma somewhat interchangeably. And I do that because I think what's stressful and what becomes traumatic for people are highly individualized, right? And so oftentimes it's interchangeable, and certainly the bodily and psychological kind of response states are largely the same, and it's just a matter of gradients. And I find that for me anyway, thinking about this in terms of gradients really helps me kind of humanize my clients and really get to know what they're feeling. For example, right now, I feel probably something like how my clients feel when they're stressed out, in some way. And what I mean is, I'm having to talk in front of a group of relative strangers, hoping to do a good job. And so if I can draw you to this cartoon on the screen, that sort of illustrates the basic stress response that exists in the human body. What I want to emphasize is that this is a very, very much normal response, a very primitive and biological state of functioning in all of us, right? And has a specific purpose, right? The sort of overall direction is, you want to activate your resources, become more alert, so that you can kind of survive in a very specific context. And that context usually is to run from predators or fight off specific threats, right? So when we talk about the stress response in the body, you can think of it as this fight or flight response, or generally, these sets of reactions are the same in all of us, right? And this is our response for a variety of stressors, right? The specific kind of feelings I think probably we're all familiar with, right? You feel your heart beating, maybe your breath becomes shallow, your palms become sweaty, and if you have to give a public presentation, important interview, and so on and so forth. And so this stress is certainly not just kind of isolated to disasters and pandemics and threat of life. And therein lies the problem, right? Is that this fight or flight response was sort of developed at a time when our threats and our stress was kind of predators and life and death. And you can imagine this becomes more problematic if your stressors are, say, your email queue, or if your stressors are psychological or chronic, or can't just be solved by fighting or flighting, running away, I should say. If in the last slide, you probably saw that a variety of organs are activated when sort of we go into this fight or flight reaction, and the brain is no different. For the purpose of just a brief background, I just want to give like a 90-second overview of how the brain works, just so we're all coming from the same place. Basically, what I want everyone to know about the brain is it's a layered and hierarchical and deeply interconnected organ, that reflects our evolutionary past. And what I mean by that is, at the bottom of the brain, you'll have what's called the brainstem that we share with, lizards and primitive animals. And the purpose of that is just to keep us alive, keep your heart beating, keep your temperature right, keep you breathing without you having to think about it. The next layer up is something called the limbic system. It's essentially the emotional center of our brain, where we get a little more human, things like excitement, fear, anxiety. Crucially for our talk, this is the part of the brain that serves as the store of our emotional memories. And in this way, a particular structure called the amygdala is sort of the emotional alarm of the brain, sort of scanning the environment for signs of bad things to come. The next layer up is something called the cerebral cortex. This is sort of the crown jewel of our human evolution, right? Takes care of all the sophisticated stuff like planning and prioritizing, impulse control, communication, collaboration, right? Everything that makes us a sort of like good team players and good hires when we're going for interviews. When everything is working well, this system is deeply interconnected, right? Information gets passed up and down to be processed at different levels. So, you have a stimuli coming, externally or internally from your body. It comes up through the limbic system, gets energized by emotions, and then goes to the cortex to get reflected upon for what we call sort of deliberate and planned and reflective action, right? Now, you can imagine that that's when everything's working well, but very easily things don't go well, right? And so when things are not going well, for example, if you're under tremendous stress, life-threatening stress, or in the past you've survived life-threatening stress, or you're under chronic stress, the system short circuits, right? And what ends up happening is, instead of going all the way, the long route through the cortical processes for reflection, when the stimuli gets to the amygdala, immediately it sets off this fight or flight reaction that I spoke to a little earlier, and all of a sudden you're off to the races. And the type of actions or behaviors we see in this kind of way is what we called reactive or reflexive action. And that's all well and good if you're running away from a tiger, but it doesn't serve us all so well when we're trying to engage in our complicated society. Two additional things I want you to know about kind of how stress changes the brain. The first is that your alarm sort of gets hypersensitized, so that you'll respond to lower thresholds of threat, so that more benign things will set off this fight or flight reaction. And the second is that the threats that you actually respond to are generalized. And what I mean by that is, instead of just being afraid of the tiger, maybe you're afraid of fast moving things in general, or open spaces in general, and so on. And so it becomes somewhat problematic in ways that you can imagine, and I'll talk about. So if that's sort of how the brain works, now I want to talk about sort of what it looks like or feels like for us and for our clients when we're operating under kind of these different states of minds. The upside down triangle probably doesn't make any sense because I erased a slide from a little earlier, but essentially it's a representation of what should be what happens when things are working well. You have the cortex or the control center, at the top overseeing everything. You have just enough of the alarm system so that you're alert. And so when things are working well, we feel pretty good, right? We feel like we have a handle on things, right? We're calm and comfortable with our tasks, right? Even if some stress comes that we're not 100% sure about, we feel like we know where the resources are and we can kind of figure it out, right? In this state, you're comfortable and you're okay with trial and error and making some mistakes. And in this way, you can always almost be a little creative and playful. And in this state, we see the big picture. So things are contextualized, and we can think into the future, and we can think about other people, and we make decisions that are good for our sort of long-term selves and long-term society. Right now, you contrast that with sort of the right-hand side of this slide, which I called survival mind. It's you see the triangle is no longer a triangle, and your control center is disappearing. In this state, the alarm is going out of control, and you really, you can just imagine, right? You feel very panicked and on edge and just tense, right? A lot of times when you're working in this state, it feels like your tires are just spinning. You're working pretty hard, but you're still kind of overwhelmed. It's a survival state of mind, right? And so what we see is that people get very defensive and irritable, and that they think in just black and whites and absolute terms, because when you're trying to survive, you don't have so much time to kind of think through everything. And the key thing I want to emphasize about these two states of mind is that it's very contagious, actually, right? And when we're in wise mind, we're able to kind of soothe the people around us. And when we're in survival mind, it kind of it's almost like you infect other people, or you transfer it to other people, your state of mind, right? And I think probably we all have some kind of experience with this when we have a very frantic client in our office, and it almost kind of it increases our internal temperature, right? So that's very important to keep in mind, because you're just not going to be able to soothe people if you yourself are in survival mind. Now, how common is trauma? This is of course not a exhaustive list, and I'm not going to read the numbers themselves, but suffice it to say that it's a significant portion of the at-risk sort of public health population, and at the at-risk population in general, right? Essentially for when you're working with populations which are incarcerated, using the shelter system, using the inpatient psychiatric care system, as well as much of the public health system, as I said, you should pretty much assume that people are coming from a history of trauma. And that's really the rule rather than the exception. In terms of the pandemic, I mean, this just to put some numbers on what we all sort of feel and know, a survey that was done in July found that more than half of adults feel that their mental health is negatively affected. Of course, this is worse with when people are isolated, when they've lost their jobs, and the thing that I like to keep in mind about this is that these traumatic and stress responses are not always matched temporarily to the stressor, right? So that when the pandemic is long gone, say a couple years from now, I think we may still feel some of these mental health effects. So now that I've gotten through kind of the context, I want to just slow myself down a little bit, so that I can really try to flesh out the next couple of slides, which I hope is more directly helpful and applicable. And that's trauma-informed practice, right? I think the first thing that I always think about in terms of trauma-informed practice is awareness, right? You have to be kind of I think it would be a bad foot to start on if you think of somebody who's traumatized as this label of, okay, PTSD, and these are their symptoms, and this is a clinical entity that's apart from me, right? So I think in that vein, the first thing that I like to think about is just being aware that what they're going through, this set of reactions, and a lot of kind of what they're thinking about is a human adaptation, right? It's biological. It's meant to keep us alive in sort of a different time, either in our evolution, or it's meant to keep us safe and comfortable at a different time in this individual sort of life history, right? And to think about it in the spectrum kind of way really helps me again humanize the clients that I'm seeing. So, you have to be aware of the trauma response in the body, and you have to be aware that, as I said in the survival mind slide, that it really changes how we kind of make decisions and how we act and all of that, I think, speaks to just that state of urgency and survival that people find themselves in, right? And so, I'm sure everyone can imagine, you maybe have different adjectives to describe, when things aren't going right. Like maybe the client is difficult or help rejecting or irrational or not taking non-compliant maybe. But I found that for me, when I see those kinds of behaviors through the lens of trauma, it really helps me kind of engage with them in a different way, right? So then I'm starting to think about, oh my goodness, like what's happened to you that you feel like this is the best thing to do, right? Instead of just labeling them as difficult and then you're sort of just butting heads, I feel like. So it's the trauma response is a learned response from a different time in their life. That's something that I think is oftentimes helpful to keep in mind, and you just have to be sensitive that at other times, the people in their lives and the agencies in their lives, weren't always benevolent, right? And could be just frankly threatening or hurting them. I've said a lot about awareness, but I want to say one point is that trauma informed practice is not the same thing as knowing about the trauma that people have gone through specifically, right? We can kind of interface our style and our work with what people are going through right now without knowing at all about what trauma or tragedy happened to them, right? I say this because oftentimes it can actually be rather traumatic or re-traumatizing for folks to kind of relive memories and to retell memories without adequate emotional support or a feeling of safety. So we needn't just on our first engagement ask specifically, oh my goodness, what actually happened to you, and make people walk you through the steps. That's for later on in treatment. In this way, if I could, I guess, just give a specific example, even in my own work, the first time I'm meeting someone, if I don't have the rapport and the sense of safety, I'll do a lot of prefacing of, okay, this might stress you out, and I don't want you to get into details that might make you uncomfortable, but I just need to know if something bad has happened to you in, these X and Y, Z ways. So that, I give them permission to not tell me, right? Or tell me as much or as little as they want, right? But I do think that asking about the presence or absence potentially or is quite important. Moving on to, I guess, the second little category from the left, I'll talk about phase-oriented treatment. And I'm a clinician, so I'll speak from a clinical background, but I hope you'll find sort of correlates to your own work, and if you do, I'd be happy to hear. We sort of handle these folks what they're going through depending on what's going on in their life, right? And I think that you always have to start from the basics, and the basics is always safety, right? You're not going to be able to do any kind of meaningful clinical work in terms of change or symptom reduction if there are more dangerous things happening, right? And so in that way, you really have to get a good sense about somebody's suicidality, right? You have to get a sense if they're self-harming, if they're coping with what they're going through in dangerous ways, including but not limited to certainly drugs and alcohol. And you have to just get people out of dangerous situations when it seems appropriate, right? And I'm sure you guys can think of lots of different examples of that. So always safety first, once you have safety, the next step in our clinical process is sort of helping people contain, you can say symptoms, or you can say just severe distress, right? a lot of folks with a history of trauma will come to us with panic attacks, just really debilitating depression, or really just like just overwhelming anxiety. So insofar as, we can just help people be in less distress, that's sort of the first step to them functioning better, and that has to be a prerequisite for sort of thinking about their specific traumas and things like that, more sophisticated things like that. The next step, once the fires are out and people are feeling okay, the next step in the treatment is what we call kind of building relationships and trust and skills, right? And that has to do with building the relationship with the therapist, so that you're trusting of them to handle your difficult emotions and to be there for you and to have benevolent wishes for you. It's about building the skills to sort of soothe your own distress, almost in anticipation of, okay, well, when we do talk about your specific trauma, you're going to have to, have some sense that you're in control and able to kind of take care of your difficult emotions, right? So it's about building skills and relationships. The final phase is about sort of examining the past and which might entail a trauma narrative, or talking specifically about the trauma. It's about changing kind of your present choices so that you have a better tomorrow, right? And so in this way, to which is somewhat long-winded, I guess, is it might take you many years before you're able to talk about the trauma. Many years, or many different therapists, or many different tries at treatment. But the important thing is that we kind of triage what's going on in the person's life, and we take care of them from sort of the bottom up. Now, moving along to the third box, I think there's a lot of good tips for working in a trauma-informed way, but I think the most important thing probably actually is to get your intentions and get your heart right. Right. Because if you just use these tips as maneuvers, then it can come off flat, or it just doesn't work so well. So in order to do this, I think it might be helpful for me to paint what I commonly hear is sort of the mindset of somebody who's under stress, or has been traumatized. And if we can just kind of work from that perspective, I think a lot of these tips will make intuitive sense, and you, as human beings who are attuned, will come up with tips that I don't mention that work well for you, right? And the mindset, I think, goes something like this. It's that the world for traumatized people is just essentially a very dangerous and unsafe place, right? The people are unpredictable. Bad things are just happening to you somewhat randomly, so you're always on guard. It's hard to trust other people with what they say, because they don't really get what you're going through, and they don't do what they say anyway. If not, they're the ones hurting you. It seems like people feel very helpless, and like they don't have a lot of good choices, and they don't have a lot of room for maneuvering to make their lives better. And it's the authority figures in your life are like your parents, or perhaps your government. Either don't respond adequately to your distress, or maybe worse, they're the ones who are hurting you. And so you can imagine, this is a really, and I pause there because it really is kind of a scary place to be, right? It's almost like you think about a very vulnerable person cowering in the corner. So when we work with that individual, I think we do have to be sensitive in some pretty specific ways, right? So the first kind of point I want to make about this is, a lot of the work is about helping people regain their sense of control, regain their sense of autonomy and efficacy, right? So that they make choices for themselves, and that you offer them reasonable choices, that and you leave it up to them to sort of invite. Maybe you don't leave it up to them, but you certainly invite them into this collaborative decision-making process with you, right? Instead of being authoritarian or directive. In this work, you really have to be aware of the power differential, right? As I said, traumatized folks often have a terrible relationships, we'll just say that, with with people in positions of power who are supposed to protect, right? And so in this way, you know, if you're kind of trying to invite the person out of the corner and you say it in a really mean and stern way, like, hey, get out, like, you know, I'm not gonna, you know, that can actually feel really frightening, you know, additionally to what they're going through, right? So you have to be aware of the power differentials in the room, and oftentimes we are in the power seat, right? You know, I try to be validating and to be understanding of what people are going through. So you know, you have to try to validate people's emotions as totally reasonable, as you know, understandable kind of reactions to what's going on for them. Even if I disagree with their decisions and choices, I'll still, you know, try my best to understand where they're coming from in making those decisions. And I tell them, I can understand why you're doing this based on what you've been through, right? But that doesn't mean that we're just totally boundaryless, right? You know, crimes are still crimes, and disrespect is still hurtful to others and ourselves. So it's about kind of working in this kind of space where you do have boundaries for consequences, but you have to try to understand where people are coming from. I think the work is about sort of modeling recovery, and actually a lot of the benefits that you know, a lot of the good things happening are not so concrete, right? I think, you know, what we model is that, okay, something terrible is happening, but we're going to try to stay calm. We're going to try to activate the control center, and we're going to try to figure this out, right? We're going to see where our resources are at, and we're going to, you know, that what you're going through is tolerable and not totally out of control, and it can get better, right? And I think a lot of the times in our engagements with our clients, you know, that kind of style of working is particularly important. Um, you know, it's always important, but I think, you know, being consistent and accountable is perhaps especially important, and you almost have to be especially sensitive to this, just because folks who have been traumatized are so used to, you know, people being flaky or people being not dependable, and so in this way, you know, well, in a sort of a clinical sense, you know, you just be on time, right? End on time. Um, Try your best to keep your appointments and do what you say. When people you know, maybe don't engage with you on the first kind of appointment, I'll usually say, okay, that's fine. How about we meet again in a month just to check in, just to show them that, hey, even if you don't want what I'm offering now, I'm still here for you. I'm still interested in helping you in other ways, right? And I think one of the keys in this is to just to, you know, own up to your mistakes, right? Either when you don't, or you're not able to follow through with something you did, or maybe you inadvertently said something that wasn't so attuned. The key thing is just to own up to the mistakes, acknowledge their hurt feelings, and try to do better next time, right? The last thing you want to do is to pretend like you know, some distress you've caused them you know, hasn't happened or wasn't your fault, or something like that. You can imagine that can be quite re-traumatizing. Individualized and person-focused care, you know, is all that's this slide essentially, in the next slide. So I won't say anything more specific about that. I'm trying to take a look at the time to see, you know, I had an example, you know, to kind of maybe demonstrate the type of attunement or the type of mindset that's important for working with, you know, folks who are in distress or respond who are acutely kind of traumatized, and that's sort of how to console. I think I'll try to go through it quickly. But I do think it's important, as Jude tells me, you know, that's a big reason of why we're here, right? Is because clients are coming quite frantic, and we're you know, our goal is to help soothe and help guide and help direct, right? So I will say a couple of things about this, I guess. You know, I think the key thing to know about this, I think, is that it's all about meta communication, right? It's not about the words that you're going to say, because, you know, oftentimes there are no magical words, right? Where we're not going to be able to say the perfect thing to help people feel altogether better. And so it's about meta communicating our care, right? And I think that kind of that urge to kind of solve things and make things completely better is totally understandable, right? As clinicians, we want to help people, but we have to know that that's not always helpful. And what I mean by this is, a lot of times our initial reaction will be something, you'll look for the silver lining, or you'll say something cliche, or if it's not clinical, maybe you'll use humor, right? And the risk of doing this is that you communicate to the person that you're saying something like, look, what you're feeling is too painful, and I don't want to feel it, and I don't want you to feel it. And so here are some things that you should do to not feel it, right? And that sort of like forcing people to come out of the corner, as I mentioned earlier, right? And so you're in danger of kind of invalidating people's distress and telling them to do something that they don't want to necessarily do. I'll say that if my wife knows I'm giving tips about this, she'll probably be very shocked. And so the point is not to be totally perfect and obsess endlessly about saying the right thing, but just to get your mindset right, and to try your best, and to apologize when you get it wrong, right? And so some specific tips in this regard, I think most of the time you would do well with just listening, of course. And when it feels like it's your turn to talk, maybe just wait another 3 seconds to see if people will continue on their line of thought, right? I think when it is your time to talk, I would ask the other person how they want to talk about it, as the first sort of entry into your conversation, right? Like, okay, well, geez, how do you want to talk about this? Do you want to do you really want to get into the details and tell me how this is affecting your lives, or your life, or are you not there yet? Are you maybe today in this space you just want to have a light conversation, and make some jokes, and try not to think about it for today? You always want to make sure kind of where the other person is coming from and what their intentions are with sharing their distress, right? And if so happens that they want to talk about it, I think that the key thing is just to be to ask questions, be open, and you're not there to say some magical thing. So for me, when I don't know what to say, I'll just say something like, gosh, what you're saying is so awful, I have no idea what to even say to you. And that's authentic. And I think when people feel that what you say and where your heart is sort of coming from the same place, and it's from a place of kind of caring, I think that, in my experience, is what soothes people the most. Let me just move on. I think when we pause for break, there'll be some specific examples that you can look at and try to come up with responses for, but certainly you don't have to. So that's sort of a whirlwind kind of summary of trauma-informed practice, and I think probably there's lots more to talk about. So if I've left something out, if you guys are thinking about other things, please let me know. So the next part I want to talk through is culturally sensitive care, and I it's sort of targeted towards the Asian American population, but I think the same principles probably apply. It's hard to talk about this care without first talking about barriers to care, and a lot of these are not unique to the Asian American population, but oftentimes it's even worse for our population, right? Things like socioeconomics, how much money people have to pay for copay, right? Do they have insurance, right? Do they have access to childcare or work leave so that they can go to appointments, right? Are mental health appointments actually available for the people who want to go? In New York City, where as sort of dire as things can seem sometimes, where that's actually not something that we suffer from as compared to the Midwest or the Upper West. So we're lucky in that regard, right? Do they have access to care that's culturally competent, get access to care that speaks their language? Lots of barriers to care, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because I think probably you're all experts for the clients that that you deal with. I do want to say two things that are specific to kind of our Asian American immigrant population. The first is just that they're immigrants, right? And that's a very unique um, kind of a vein of life history that that we have to deal with, right? Not everyone immigrates for the same reason, but usually it's not the best, right? It's poverty, it's persecution, right? And the reasons people leave, wars, famine, traumatic stuff, right? So that's a big part of kind of what we're dealing with, and not everyone has the same kind of process with immigration, right? Some people enter into the country illegally and then are living in fear of deportation, right? Not everyone has the same kind of experiences with social services once they get to the country, right? If you don't speak the language, somebody knocking on your door is actually quite intimidating, right? And I know in communist China, if the government comes knocking on your door saying they're going to help you, you're actually that's actually quite threatening, right? So not everyone has the same kind of basic trusting orientation with kind of social services or government agencies, and certainly not mental health agencies, right? Language capacity of immigrants is something we have to take into account. Their legal status, their green card status, these and a million other things that's related to the immigration process, I think is perhaps unique to our immigrant population. The other thing that I want to speak about is shame. Shame is again not unique to us, but for us, I think it can take on a different maybe cultural context. And it's that shame in Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, often seen as bad karma or sins of the family or sins of the ancestor, right? Feels like it reflects poorly on their parents or their family if they're seen as mentally ill. You face the danger of being sort of rejected by your family and your social circle. You might not be able to marry, and so lots of consequences, right? And I think the way I'll just say one thing about working with it is I think the key again is to not stigmatize people as sort of mentally ill and having sort of specific diagnoses, and to frame sort of the people's troubles and problems of living, right? That they're not able to work, right? Or they're not able to sleep, right? Or they're having fights with their family, instead of these specific kind of clinical diagnoses. I think that's something that's helped me in sort of sidestepping this factor of shame. But certainly it's not easy and it's not always effective. Moving on to the second box about knowing the individual. I think culturally sensitive care in this way is somewhat similar to trauma sensitive care, right? You don't have to know everything about the culture and the cultural traditions and the spirituality and the reasons people immigrate, through the different time periods to do a good job, right? And more important probably is that you just ask, right? You ask about the different barriers that I mentioned just now. You ask about their life history and their immigration history. You ask about kind of what their expectations and assumptions are with getting care, with working with your agency. I know with our work in mental health, we hear certain things quite frequently, right? If I go to see the psychiatrist, I'm going to be forced to take medicine, and then I'm going to, be on medicines for the rest of my life. If I say how I feel, then they're going to involuntarily hospitalize me, and maybe it's going to affect my immigration status and my green card application. People have lots of different assumptions that we can help talk them through, right? And I think in this way, when people don't want to see me, and even in people in the clinic, right, they've come for psychotherapy but they don't want to see me, I just reassure, look, it's just a conversation, right? I'm here to help you, and you're the boss. I'm not your parents, I'm not the police. I can't make you do anything. I'll say a caveat on safety later on, but that's the general mindset. Is a lot of, I think, these assumptions and expectations, if we get them out in the open, are things that we can actually talk through, right? taboos, family conflict is taboo, domestic violence is taboo, substance use is taboo. And knowing that these things are taboo, makes that should push you to perhaps ask about them more so, because you should expect that people have a harder time kind of bringing that up spontaneously. The third box about respecting the culture, I think this is about respecting that this culture and the individual in front of you, they have their own worldview and their own explanations and their own rationales, right? And if you were to just come in with our Western biomedical kind of approach, that's basically like hammer, like you just take your hammer to a person's entire worldview. Usually it doesn't end up working so well. So in this way, I try my best to just respect what people think is going on, right? I know in the Chinese community, we speak about something being hot or cold or damp or dry, and if possible, I speak in those terms, right? I say, your mood is, because maybe your brain is hot, right, or something like that. And I think the more you can use sort of people's language and metaphors, and you use the language of their distress, the more likely that they'll feel heard, and the more likely they'll say something like, oh, well, yeah, this guy actually knows what I'm going through. Let me see what he has to, let me think about what he is suggesting, right? Versus if you have the impression of, this guy has no idea what I'm going through, why should I do what he says, right? Along the same lines, I think we should respect kind of cultural healing practices, and a like a Western biomedical kind of approach to kind of life, right? So if people want to use qigong or meditation, or they want to go visit with their spiritual elders, I very much respect that. But at the same time, I'll say, look, hey, how about you come back in a month, and we'll see how things are going, and we continue this conversation. The fourth box, just some specifics. I think talking to people about getting treatment for a lot of times, I'll say we get too intellectualized, right? You should get treatment for your depression, and what have you, and we use labels that just serve to kind of distance us from people, right? So as much as possible, I just try to tell people, look, this is what we're working on. We're working on your sleep. We're working on the fact that you can't concentrate at work, right? We're working on the fact that maybe you're having fights with your family, right? And to help people kind of think about concrete gains like that, right? And along the same lines, because family is so important in sort of the Asian American culture, in the West, our basic kind of unit of existence is the individual, right? How we're feeling, where our careers are going, how my life is. And that's sometimes not the case with our immigrant populations, right? The unit of existence is the family. And so if I have to suffer a little bit so that my family does better, that's fine, right? And so in this way, you do well to appeal to the family, right? Either talking to people about the potential gains of the family if they were to get help, right? Or in specific cases, I'll often say, I'll often try to call the family, right? Speak to the head of the household, speak to the person who seems like they have the most reservation about whatever I'm offering, and try to talk them through what I'm thinking about, right? Because I think when you sort of show respect to kind of that kind of structure, typically people will respond better. And the last thing about specifics is, just to focus on the concrete benefits, right? Oftentimes coming for mental, and you guys probably have correlates in your own work, but, coming for mental health services mean that we can, fill out papers for, housing, right? Or we can, if you're really having a hard time for at work, we can help you take some time off for short-term disability, right? Or if you're applying for your green your naturalization, sometimes we can write you a letter to say that probably you benefit from an interpreter, or maybe that should be waived altogether, right? Those are all things that we can think about, right? And I don't want to sort of have people just coming for those benefits, but oftentimes we're just looking for any way to get our foot in the door to start talking to people about these issues, right? So the more concrete we can get, the more we can match what we're offering to what people are looking for. Actually, I think that's a direction that we should think in. Just a couple of maybe disparate ideas about getting people care. That psychological first aid, that first conversation you have with somebody coming in a state of distress. I think we've already mentioned a little bit about in prior slides, but it's focusing on the basics first, right? Do you have shelter and food and some basic sense of safety, right? Do you have an accurate kind of maybe understanding of kind of the facts of whatever disaster that you're undergoing, so that you're not getting triggered and traumatized by false information? I think this is probably more important for me to say to other clinicians, other psychiatrists, because we're in danger of just jumping into kind of symptoms and so on, but probably it will be more obvious to you guys. I want to say a word about collaborative care. If a large part of this presentation so far has been about sort of meeting people where they are psychologically, I think this is sort of about meeting people where they are physically, right? And there's a lot of problems with the traditional model of care of making referrals to the mental health office, and you got to go, you got to make your appointment, your insurance, and tons of different barriers just in that referral process. So more and more people are thinking about embedding mental health services in the primary care doctor's office, so that they can become treatment and be under the same roof and be in a more familiar setting and so on. So that's something that I would encourage everyone to think about, is to sort of engage people's family care, the primary care doctors, especially because a lot of these mental health issues present psychosomatically in our population. And as a corollary to this, I think it's not just about embedding mental health services kind of in other doctors' offices, but I would be curious kind of whether we might be able to embed kind of our mental health services in the various organizations that you guys work with. Again, with the sort of goal of reaching people where they're actually coming in for whatever care they're coming in for. Just a word about stigma. It's a societal issue, right? It's certainly bigger than just kind of our one-on-one interactions, but there is something that can be done in our one-on-one interactions, right? And that's that there's stigma within us too, right? So people are going to feel if we're uncomfortable talking about difficult feelings or mental illness and so on and so forth. So I think it's really important to kind of check in with ourselves about how we feel about this big subject. As a caveat to everything I've said so far, you want to meet people where they're at. You want to help them make the next best reasonable decision for them. But there are certain safety issues like suicidality or violence that we do have to confront, and that we do have to meet with emergency services. And so just something to keep in mind that we do have this responsibility kind of as part of our work. This is the end of the first part of the presentation. I'll just leave this slide up with a couple of things that people might say when they're in distress, that you guys can consider how you might respond to, but certainly you don't have to. And this time now is for the small group discussion.
So Mike, I think, we're running a little behind schedule, so maybe about 10 minutes in the small group. So we're going to break people out into just groups of 3. And if you could just choose one, maybe hypothetical situation and how you as a group might respond to that. We'll just come back all together and maybe share out some of the strategies from this presentation that you think would have applied in the situation that you talked about. So I'm going to have Sylvia place us in small groups. And let's say in about 10 minutes, we'll ask you to come back and talk a little bit about what you discussed as a group of how you would address one of these situations.